Hello everyone, the lesson for today is spiritual ecology, or as I'm subtitling it, religion and the environment. What's up with that? As you might have guessed, it's a particular favorite topic of mine since that's where a lot of my own research has centered, and I hope today to be able to share some things that will be of interest to you, that will be thought-provoking for you, whether or not this is your particular topic of interest. One of the points that I want to make, very simply, at the start of this lecture is that knowledge is more than just facts. Now, lest you think that I'm trying to make some sort of ontological relativist point here, or trying to suggest that the facts don't matter, please be assured that that is not the case. Dunstan still believes in climate change and seriousness of COVID and science in general as a way of knowing and discovering the world. Having said that, knowledge, what I mean by knowledge is more than just facts is, well, let me actually get into it a little bit. Last couple of weeks we've been talking a lot about traditional ecological knowledge, and not all but a lot of the examples that I've shared have involved looking at things such as how indigenous groups classify their environment. Linguistically, the different labels that are attached onto different animal species, or the different understandings of population dynamics over time, all of which is very fascinating stuff. So a good example of that, for example, would be this from a recent paper by Juan Bachano, which talks about, Inca or Quechua speaker nowadays is how we would typically say that, who historically experimented with seeds to determine which plants are more resilient. The Inca people domesticated approximately 70 crop species. Knowledge holders, this person interviewed, Sonia Quispe and Maria Tinto, enthusiastically acknowledged the biodiversity of the crops. We grow more than 50 varieties of corn here in Choquecancha. And Peru is a country with one of the highest levels of biodiversity in the world, and talks about all the different types of potatoes, corn, and other quinoa and other crops. That's a good example of an ethnoecology study, right? Talking about all the different types of domesticated cultivars perfected by Quechua-speaking people at present and historically by Incan ancestors. And indeed, there's lots of good research about sort of Quechua people and the sort of ways in which they, Quechua farmers to this day, experiment with different domesticated crops, trying them out in different locations, seeing what works and what doesn't, and developing this rich, robust body of TEK about food species. And that's all fascinating and interesting and important part of understanding knowledge systems about the environment. But it would not, I think as we've been sharing those different examples, though, 2 weeks ago, this week, or last week, and even this week, I wonder if you've thought at all about what's missing. What's missing in some of these studies of ethnoecology, or maybe even some of these studies of TEK. And I want us to specifically be thinking about when, for example, we talked about the idea of that when TEK is integrated into Western policymakers' work, that it's missing parts of it, or it's piecemeal. Well, if we're calling that piecemeal, what is it that's not being fully taken in? Again, what's missing in some of these studies and some of these policies? And I think part of what stands out to me is that a lot of times when we write papers like this, they're valuable, they're wonderful, they're important, but it's only one layer of how people know the land around them, or know their landscape, as far as like how they label it or what different crops they grow in it. There's a whole other layer or layers of people's sacred understandings, and more generally just kind of worldview understandings of spiritual entities, of ethical beliefs, of moral beliefs, which don't have to be spiritual by any stretch of the imagination. All these kind of deeper layer, sort of nature of nature kind of questions that are also part of how people know the land, that so far we've mostly avoided. And so now we're going to jump into it feet first. I want to share an example from Peru in the Andes Mountains, mainly drawing on the research of Marisol de la Cadena, who's a very well-known anthropologist. She talks about, in a 2010 paper that I really like, she talks about, and forgive me, those of you who took my religion class and that this is a repeat for, but she talks about going to an anti-mine protest that she was at among Quechua speakers, specifically from the Alzangate region of Peru. And, she's at this protest, and she's talking to her friend Nazario, who's local, And Nazario and her are basically like, yeah, the mine can't go forward. And she's thinking like, yeah, because the mine would really mess up the farmers' fields and the fields that people use for running their domesticated animals on and things like that. And then Nazario is basically like, well, yeah, definitely. But then he adds, the Asangate, this mountain up here in the upper right, would not allow the mine in Sinakara, which is like a smaller nearby mountain, this one. Asangate would get mad, could even kill people. To prevent that killing, the mine should not happen. And De la Cadena remarks, I could not agree more, and although I could not bring myself to think that Asangate would kill, I found it impossible to consider it a metaphor. So in other words, Nazario was saying, well, yeah, environmental destruction would happen from this mine, including the fact that the mountain itself would kill people. For this other mountain, this larger kind of presiding mountain, who's a spiritual entity, a sentient being, would be upset about mining going on this smaller mountain, Sankara, and therefore start to kill people, kind of as an act of wrath for people violating other sentient mountains, other sacred mountains, other being mountains within that domain. So it's a fascinatingly different look at that, and De la Cadena kind of develops that further to suggest that on some level the mountains then are kind of playing a political role. In the sense that they're being political actors, right? People are regarding them as beings, as sentient entities who have a voice in political matters. This, by the way, is informed by a broader kind of thing. So Sankara here, this mountain, it's the site of a pilgrimage that draws about 10,000 people a year in Peru. Mainly Peruvians, very few foreigners, or people from other parts of the Andes region as well. Koilur Riti, forgive me as I'm not a Quechua speaker. Traditionally, this was a festival that would happen when Pleiades, the constellation, would reappear, and people regarded that as like the beginning of the harvest season. It was the beginning of the harvest season, after a 40-day period of absence where it kind of dips behind your line of sight, and so you don't see it for 40 days in that region. By the way, when people saw when the stars were really bright when it reappeared, I think that meant like good harvest, and conversely, if it was dim, it meant poor harvest, or I might have that flipped, so there's an astrological interpretation of the stars there. But in any case, people still pilgrimage up to this mountain. Originally, it was to venerate and honor Periakaka, the god of rain, or torrential rains, which obviously would have been very important to venerate from the perspective of farming people. Nowadays, it's very much syncretized. People blend it with Christian beliefs, and there's the conceptualization that Christ appeared on this mountain in a specific iteration. So, fascinating stuff, right? Really fascinating stuff. She talks also in this reading, De la Cadena, that I didn't have you do this reading, but I just wanted to mention that she also mentions another phenomena, which I find very interesting, that other scholars have talked about as well, which is the Andean concept of Pachamama. So within Quechuan, again, that's the descendants of the people that we typically call the Inca. Among Quechuan people, Pachamama is a mother deity, representing really Earth as a mother. So this is a quote from another study by Petronia Quispe. She says, Pachamama is my mother. I consider myself the offspring of Pachamama because she's like a mother who feeds us with many foods. In gratitude, I sing and dance for her every day in my chakra. Here in this community, we value and respect Pachamama very much because without seeds, we would not have anything to eat. For that reason, I feel like the offspring of Pachamama, and as a daughter, I hold responsibilities to preserve the well-being of Pachamama and all my other relatives. The Apus, or mountains, which oftentimes in Quechua traditional pre-Christian thought, many of the mountains were regarded as sacred and sentient beings, and to some degree people still think that way, as the Nazario example just showed. The Apus and lakes to be able to continue with the legacy of my ancestors and preserve our seeds and well-being. So Pachamama is a widespread kind of conceptualization of Earth as mother, and that's certainly not the only indigenous group to have that conceptualization, and indeed that's of course an extremely widespread concept, thinking of Earth in mother-like terms, or nature in mother-like terms. What perhaps makes this even more interesting is that in 2008, this became part of the Ecuadorian Constitution. So in Chapter 7 of the Ecuadorian Constitution that was passed in 2008,